I can't think of a better follow-up to Acting Coordinator Godfrey's remarks than the fantastic panel that will be led by Peter Bergen, Vice President for Global Studies and Fellows at New America. Mr. Bergen is the author of 9 books and was the first reporter to interview Osama bin Laden in 1997. He will facilitate today's discussion panel on the evolution of the global security landscape, and he will be joined by 2 panelists that, Peter, I will allow you to introduce. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. On the screen, we have joining us is Ambassador Edmund Fitton-Brown, who's had a distinguished career in the British Foreign Service. He was ambassador to Yemen. He now runs the UN cell that is directed at al-Qaeda and Taliban, issues some very, very interesting reports on a regular basis about the status of al-Qaeda, Taliban, and also ISIS. And we're joined here on the stage by Assistant Director Charles Spence of the FBI, who is in charge of international operations for the FBI and has served there for a quarter of a century, including in Afghanistan. So let me start. I have some general questions for both of you. Let's start with Ambassador Fitton-Brown. How would you rate the status of al-Qaeda today? Weak, strong? What are their weaknesses? What are their strengths? Are they going to be able to resurrect themselves in the new environment in Afghanistan?
Thanks, Peter. I trust you can hear me well.
Yes.
I'm delighted to be here. It's great to be part of this. I just wish I could be there in person. In terms of al-Qaeda, I would characterize them as having been strategically patient over the years, which was not always a good look compared to the rapid expansion and the sort of spectacular successes that ISIL had for a while. But I think that looks more like a source of strength now, in the sense that al-Qaeda has survived, its brand has survived, and it remains embedded in a number of conflict zones around the world, which has given it a locus and the opportunity to train and sustain its popularity. It does have weaknesses. Particularly its propaganda is not very well judged in terms of attracting a wide audience. It tends to be rather ponderous, not as appealing as ISIL's. And it lacks a directed external operations capability. So it's doing a lot of violence, a lot of operations in conflict zones, but it's a long while since it's directed anything outside conflict zones.
Assistant Director Spence, what do you think about that?
I agree. I think they are smart, that they played the long game. They did play the long game, I think, knowing, I mean, if you go all the way back to the 90s, I mean, bin Laden pledged allegiance to Taliban, and I think the Taliban has been a supporter of al-Qaeda for all this time, and they knew that if the Taliban came back in, I believe those allegiances, I believe those understandings will still be there. I think whether externally, whether the Taliban says it will embrace it or not, I think the long-standing relationship they've had will carry through. And I also agree with the ambassador on that the great weakness of al-Qaeda. I mean, al-Qaeda was on oxygen for a while. They were very low. You know, we'd been very effective in disrupting them. They have made steady gains coming back, but I think they are gaining strength, and this will reinvigorate them, I think, to a significant amount. As far as weaknesses, though, I do believe compared to ISIS and some of the other groups, they are behind the times on propaganda, like the ambassador said as well.
And then ISIS, again to you, Ambassador Fitton-Brown. Obviously, we have the kind of core ISIS, we have ISIS Khorasan. What are the strengths of the overall organization? What are the strengths of some of these affiliates? What are the weaknesses? What is your prognosis for how they are going to do going forward?
Yeah, and forgive me if I use the term ISIL, it's just muscle memory, and it's the term that we tend to use in the UN along with the term Daesh. ISIL, of course, flamed out in a way. It achieved something that was on an enormous scale in terms of the domination of territory and creating a pseudo-state. And of course, al-Qaeda always said that this was premature and reckless. And al-Qaeda feels vindicated because ISIL was defeated militarily, first in Iraq in 2017 and then finally in Syria in 2019. But ISIL is still well embedded in both of those countries. They had time to prepare. They saw the military defeat coming, and they reverted to a covert network in both countries. And they still have a lot of resources, a lot of support, and remain very dangerous. Now, outside the core area, what they did was that they decided to delegate authority and to create a structure of regional networks which would help to sustain the remote provinces, as they used to call them. And in that respect, the progress of those provinces has been varied. There are areas where it looks to have been quite a successful evolution, others less so. What has been most striking this year has been the progress of a number of terrorist group affiliates in Africa, and of course this also applies to al-Qaeda. But the question was about ISIL, and ISIL's presence that is known as the West Africa province, or ISWAP, which is based in the Lake Chad Basin, essentially in and around northeastern Nigeria, is now a large and very capable presence, and also has as it were, a spoke or a side affiliate called IS Greater Sahara, which is active further to the west broadly in the sort of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso border area. And though ISWAP and ISGS have brought off a lot of attacks in recent years, but certainly they look no less strong this year, with ISWAP having defeated and largely assimilated the Shekau faction of Boko Haram earlier this year. And then IS Central Africa Province, ISCAP, which is organizationally linked to the IS hub in Somalia, but which is primarily manifested in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo and in northern Mozambique, has also had a lot of successes recently. And perhaps the most eye-catching event, or the most eye-catching achievement of any ISIL affiliate this year was the takeover of a strategically important town in the far north of Mozambique, close to an LNG project of international strategic significance, where this town was called Palma, and it's the local affiliate there of ISIL successfully took over this town and then withdrew in good order, having acquired spoils, and remains positioned for future operations in and around Cabo Delgado province, which is that northern and easternmost province of Mozambique near the Tanzanian border.
Assistant Director Spencer.
I think the expansion of ISIS in Africa, as the ambassador said, the rapid expansion, the success they've had, and the capability they've shown has probably been the most surprising thing I've seen in the last couple of years. And when I meet with a lot of my partners from the African nations, especially with Mozambique and some of the other countries, as you mentioned before, Burkina Faso, Mali, that is their number one concern. Their number one concern of their government is the expansions of ISIS, are these terrorist groups operating in their country. And I think we're seeing things we've never seen before, such as we're talking about Mozambique. The countries are almost ceding portions of their territory to some of these groups right now and basically operating them as an exclusion zone, kind of leaving them alone. And I think that is with the agreement that they're not going to attack outside that zone, almost giving them a certain level of autonomy. And I think that is a scary outlook for anyone, rule of law nation, that you would let that happen in your country. So one of the things we've been trying to do is Mr. Godfrey said, is provide capability, support, capacity building, but that only goes so far. I think ISIS has been very effective at rebranding and basically retooling themselves after their defeat, which was quite spectacular. But I think they've shown their adaptability, and they've shown a lot of their adaptability in technology. I mean, I think they are the go-to, they're the Nike brand of any extremist group on how to sell your group to your people that you're trying to recruit, you're trying to fundraise for. They are the brand. They are basically the top brand for it. I think they're very good at that, and that will enable them to be effective for probably a lot longer than we thought they would have after the Daesh fell. I will say that letting several thousand of them recently released from Afghanistan, from the prisons, whether that be at Bergen or Polchakri, how that is going to enable the organization, because a lot of them are senior leaders, a lot of them have a lot of history and a lot of command and control structure. Is that going to make it grow? Probably significantly, make the problem worse, I think, globally as well as in Afghanistan.
Well, two follow-ups to that. One, you mentioned the releases from Bagram outside Kabul and Polchakri, which is also outside Kabul. Clearly, there were thousands of prisoners there, al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban. Why did the Taliban release ISIS prisoners given their long history of animosity? A question for both of you.
Honestly, I have no idea.
But you know for a fact.
Yes, I was surprised by that.
Yeah.
Maybe it was to just, we're going in now and we're going to open the gates and let everyone go out. I was very surprised, or they didn't have them segregated appropriately so that they couldn't basically figure out who was with who. But I would have thought the same thing, that if the Taliban, when they did take it over, they would have kept a lot of those ISIS prisoners there, because all they were doing on some levels hurting themselves as well.
Ambassador?
Yeah, no, I agree with that answer. I think it's a slightly complex picture. It's something I think will have depended on who got to the prisons first, and I'm not convinced, given the speed of what happened in Afghanistan, I'm not convinced that the Taliban were absolutely ready to figure out exactly what they wanted to do about some of these issues that they sort of suddenly had to deal with, like that business of taking over the prisons. It's notable that they very deliberately killed Abu Umar Khorasani, the former head of ISIL Khorasan. So this is the guy who was running ISIL's affiliate in Afghanistan up until last year. And so they had some people that they had in mind as definite enemies that they were determined to settle scores with. But it's hard to explain what the thinking is in letting out people who, at least on the face of it, might look now as if they're a threat to the Taliban themselves.
Well, that raises two or three related questions. One, as far as I understand it, most of the ISIS-K in Afghanistan are former members of the Taliban who sort of slapped on the ISIS patch. Is that correct?
A significant. There are some foreign fighters involved from some of the surrounding publics. There are some fighters that have come in that are Uyghurs, I think, that are supporting ISIS, and I think that could play some problems later on if China decides to come in there and work with the Taliban. I think there are some multinational. There's some from Turkmenistan, some from Uzbekistan, but the majority of them, I think, as you said, just change patches.
Share that view, Ambassador?
Broadly, yes. I mean, the way that we've characterized it in our reports is that certainly up until recently, the largest single component of ISIL-K was people who had left the Pakistani Taliban, in other words, what the group known as TTP, which of course is also present in numbers in Afghanistan and is broadly aligned with the Afghan Taliban. And then you've got, I think more recently, it's probably true to say that the balance of the ISIL-K membership has slightly shifted in favor of Afghans. There is widespread reporting, although it's not fully established, that the current leader of ISIL-K, Dr. Shahab al-Muhajir, is himself a former member of the Haqqani network. And of course, the Haqqani network is a component of the Taliban. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with that answer. I think it's a pretty complicated picture. I think the foreign fighter component in the classic sense, if you like, people who might have relocated from other conflict zones, for example, from Iraq and Syria after the military defeat of ISIL in Syria, I think that component is very small. The relocator issue in Afghanistan up to now has been less numerically significant than we expected it to be. But I absolutely agree that there are a good few people who've been drawn in from the region and who are from the Central Asian, either Central Asian ethnicity, but also Central Asian nationality.
Question for you, Ambassador. I think in your reports, you've sort of hinted at the idea that ISIS-K may be a kind of cutout for the Haqqani network. Is that something you can elaborate on?
That would be too strong a statement. I mean, you're right that there is material in the report about, in recent reports that we've published, about ambivalent relations possibly between the Taliban and ISIL-K. Member states don't agree on this, so it's important for me not to be too deterministic about it. But there's certainly a lot of people in ISIL-K who have some kind of Haqqani or Taliban background. Now, are they people who have defected and become sworn enemies of the Taliban? What we reported in our report was that there have certainly been attacks which ISIL-K has claimed in Afghanistan where there was doubt as to whether they actually perpetrated them or whether they might have been perpetrated by the Haqqani network, who, of course, one of the special features of the Haqqani network is that they have tactical autonomy. They pursue operations in the strategic interests of the Taliban, but they have the tactical autonomy to do that by whatever means they consider to be necessary. And in a multi-sided conflict, which of course is what we had until recently in Afghanistan and arguably still have, there was an argument from the Taliban side that some of the attacks that ISIL-K claimed or carried out were weakening the government of Afghanistan and therefore were in the strategic interests of the Taliban. So that issue of whether there was some level of collaboration or deconfliction, or indeed cases where the Haqqanis themselves carried out an attack and simply didn't claim it, and ISIL-K were happy to claim anything because they were more interested in showing their reach and not concerned about whether there were civilian casualties in the attack. I think if you put all of those things together, you have a complex dynamic that needs to be further investigated and understood.
What do you think?
I think that dynamic's going to become much, much clearer in the next 6 months to a year. And I think we'll be able to see much clearer what a picture of who is backing who and who's working with who. So whether they're cut out or not, I believe that is kind of a strong word based on the intelligence we have. But I think that's going to become very clear sooner than you think.
Okay, well, so the big sort of elephant in the room is Siraj Haqqani, who, as you know, is now Minister of the Interior. In American terms, that means running Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, who, according to Ambassador Fitton-Brown's recent report, is on the Leadership Council of al-Qaeda. So beginning with you, Assistant Director, what do you make of all that?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting how the United States government interacts with the new government in Afghanistan based on that, because so many members of the government are from Taliban or from al-Qaeda or have this background. How are we going to get around that? Because here you have members of a designated terrorist organization that are now essentially running a government that, for many reasons, it's what the administration comes up with. On some way, shape, or form, the United States may have to support, whether it be economically or we end up with NGOs or supporting NGOs working there. But there has to be some type of relationship there based on our 20-year history of being in the country. I think that's going to make it very difficult for us it's much more difficult to navigate those nuances because of that.
Are there any analogies that you can think of in American history for the US government dealing with a government with so many designated terrorists?
In an official capacity like this, probably not.
Ambassador Fitton-Brown?
Well, I mean, let me just go back to your sort of introductory point, because it is just important to say exactly what the report said, which is that Siraj Haqqani is assessed to be a member of the wider al-Qaeda leadership, but not of the al-Qaeda core leadership shura. So it's just slight nuance from what you said, but the point is absolutely relevant and absolutely right. Siraj Haqqani embodies the organic link between the Taliban and al-Qaeda and his appointment into that role leads us to believe that al-Qaeda has a secure safe haven in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future.
What does it mean as a matter of UN policy for, I understand that 14 of the 33 first picks in the Taliban cabinet are designated in some shape or form by the United Nations. So a little under half of the cabinet is designated by the organization you're part of. What does that mean in practice for the way the UN deals with them or other member states?
Well, so first of all, it's important to say that all of those designated individuals are designated under the 1988 sanctions regime, which is concerned with peace and security in Afghanistan. It's not specifically a counter-terrorist sanctions list. But I mean, I don't want to overstate that point. And of course, we also recognise, particularly on this platform and in this context, having had the earlier words from John Godfrey, that the Taliban is regarded certainly designated as a terrorist group by the United States. What does it mean in practice to have sanctioned individuals in these positions? That is a great question. 17 of the 33 that you mentioned are actually in the cabinet that the Taliban has announced, so as it were, with sort of de facto ministerial roles. What we've found in practice is that up to now, there has been no discernible impact of the sanctions regime, the 1988 sanctions regime, on humanitarian delivery in Afghanistan. And this is a major concern, of course, of the UN and the international community to make sure that humanitarian delivery continues in Afghanistan and indeed is stepped up because of the dreadful economic and humanitarian situation in the country. But at the same time, it's, being sanctioned doesn't mean that you can't be engaged. It's possible to talk to people who are under sanctions. Indeed, the UN gave travel ban exemptions to a number of sanctioned Taliban to take part in the peace talks that went on over the last couple of years. And that travel ban exemption continues to be extended to this day. So it doesn't prevent people from discussing with the Taliban, but what it does do is it calls into question the ability of those individuals to conduct various forms of business. It calls into question their ability to travel unless they have a travel ban exemption. Same with financial transactions and, of course, with any kind of acquisition of arms. So the Taliban are very anxious to have this sanctions regime abolished, and they argue that that was promised to them under the Doha Accords at the end of February last year. The international community has yet to take a position on that.
I think one thing I would add is if the Taliban is trying to rebrand itself a little bit as being more moderate, and they know the sanctions would be in place, it is curious that they would name so many people on their leadership councils that we know are branded, that they know are branded by the UN, by the United States, by European countries as designated terrorists. I think that's a question that I would have if I'm trying to start this new government and do this and trying to turn over essentially a new stone and start anew.
Yeah. So just to clarify, you said 17 of these 33 cabinet officials are on some sort of UN list. Is that correct?
17 in the de facto cabinet.
So I'm just trying to understand, obviously, the Taliban want to be recognized, and probably the Chinese may be the first, followed by Pakistan, followed by Russia, potentially Qatar or Turkey. I mean, what are the impediments, as a practical matter, you're a professional diplomat, Ambassador Fitton-Brown, given the makeup of that cabinet, for other countries to recognize them?
Well, recognition hasn't yet surfaced as a direct issue. It's obviously something that whenever you have a change in control in a country, it's something that people contemplate. I think recognition is possible because, of course, it's not the Taliban itself that is sanctioned under 1988. It's named individuals and entities. So you could have a scenario in which a country recognized but was careful about the nature of its dealings with members of that government who were sanctioned. And in that respect, of course, you can make a parallel with some other UN national sanctions regimes that exist. Nevertheless, it's obviously an impediment, and it might be regarded also as an embarrassment in terms of developing cordial relations. So I think that it's likely that that the international community will want to, over time, look at this Taliban claim that they were promised that the UN sanctions regime would be lifted. But of course, for that to happen would require a good deal of international agreement to do that. And as a point I think that was just made very well by Spence, which is, are the Taliban behaving in a way that looks as if they're trying to build confidence or looks as if they're trying to be provocative?
But it looks like they're trying to have it both ways. If they're saying part of the agreement was the sanctions would be listed, and you in your own report in June said that al-Qaeda and the Taliban are closely aligned. In fact, I think you said that they've become more closely aligned. I mean, can you reflect on, I mean, do you still think, your June report said they were closely aligned, I'm quoting it, and based on marriage and other factors. Is that still your view today?
It is absolutely my view today, and sorry, I hope I didn't sound as if I was disagreeing with you. I completely agree with your proposition which you're making here, which is, yes, they are trying to have it both ways. And that, in that respect, they are hoping, I think, to secure further concessions up front from the international community without making meaningful concessions themselves. I already mentioned the role of Siraj ad-Din Haqqani, but another important thing to mention is the return in late August of Amin al-Haq, who is sanctioned on the 1267 list. In other words, he's an al-Qaeda, senior al-Qaeda terrorist. He's actually the 002 on our list, so sort of the second person to be sanctioned under 1267. And he returned to Afghanistan, was photographed in Nangarhar, photographed in Kabul, with absolutely no inhibition about showing his presence. And so, yes, the situation is still the same. And as you say, if anything, the relationship looks almost even closer, because whereas there was some inhibition about al-Qaeda showing themselves in Afghanistan until recently, that inhibition doesn't seem to exist anymore.
I will say this, as they are ministers, they're politicians, so playing it both ways comes as part of their business now, so they're doing it okay.
Reflecting on what the ambassador just said, the return of al-Haq to Afghanistan, what does that mean to you?
I mean, I definitely think they're going to get closer. I think al-Qaeda is going to be back in Afghanistan very prominently, very quickly. So I agree with I 100% agree with the ambassador.
You served in Afghanistan, so you know it quite well. So if we'd had this conversation a year ago, I think it would have been a very different conversation, presumably.
If you'd have said a year ago, no, I think we'd be having a very similar conversation. 5 years ago, it would be a very different conversation.
Okay.
I think the writing was on the wall a year ago. I think it might have, happened a little quicker at the end than we thought it would, but I think the writing was on the wall a year ago.
So how would you characterize the situation in Afghanistan today in terms of its willingness to host foreign terrorist organizations? The U.S. military has repeatedly said that 20 jihadi foreign terrorist organizations in Afghanistan, the U.S. military. And it's not just al-Qaeda and ISIS-K, it's also groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which may not be a threat to Europe or the United States, but certainly a threat to India and countries in the region. So can you reflect a little bit in detail about where we're going to be 2 or 3 years down the road?
I think al-Qaeda definitely will have a fairly free hand to operate there. What they're going to do with it and what that means for al-Qaeda, I'm not sure yet. I think the Taliban realize that if al-Qaeda does perform operations directed at outside targets, probably outside from Afghanistan, that's not going to be good for them. So I don't know what kind of control.
But they did that last time they were in charge.
I know.
They were in charge for 5 years.
So I know, we'll see. I think they're going to try and keep that as reined in as they can. I don't know they will, but I definitely think they will try.
Okay, let me sketch a scenario, which is 2 or 3 years from now, a group of Europeans, not Americans, go to Afghanistan, get some training, carry out an attack in Paris, kill dozens of people.
Right.
And it's not really clear if it's al-Qaeda or ISIS or some jihadi group, but it's traceable back to Afghanistan. The Taliban say, hey, we had no idea. And maybe they didn't. But I mean, it seems to me that there are a series of things that are going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years that are pretty predictable. One is ethnic cleansing by the Taliban, which we've already seen a little bit of. 2 is an attack in Europe where somebody's trained there. 3 is inspirational attacks, say, in the United States, not people who are just sitting by their computers, as they did in Orlando and San Bernardino with ISIS. So can you reflect on these futures? And I know, of course, predicting the future is hard.
I think it will be harder to travel. I think.
Yeah, so let's leave aside the travels.
So sorry for the European travelers. I think that model has changed. I do think, the sharing, the information sharing, the biometric sharing with countries is so much better now. I think it's not impossible to travel, but I think it is harder for travel for Europeans or for Westerners to get into these non-permissive areas than it used to be. So I think that's an issue. How the administration or how we're going to handle that situation, I mean, I really think it's going to have to see how it plays out. I hate to say that, but I think we're going to see how our relationship goes with the Taliban. They've said openly right now that they're not going to assist the United States in any way, shape, or form against any terrorist group that's operating, any armed assistance, any terrorist group operating in Afghanistan. They've already said that, including over-the-horizon strikes. They're not permitting.
Were you surprised by that?
No, I was not. I don't think anyone was. They don't want the U.S. I think it would hurt their brand or their image too much for the U.S. to have any influence or anything like any kind of armed influence back in that country again. So I think that was not a big surprise. But I also think when you're talking about permissive groups, ISIS-K, I think they're going to have a significant rejuvenation inside Afghanistan for what we talked about earlier, because we let out thousands of their operatives in the country. They're right there. They're going to go back to war with the Taliban. I think they've already seen some of it. We've seen some attacks. And I think we're going to see that as well. And I think you might see that. You may see ISIS grow significantly in Afghanistan as well.
By the way, is it your assessment, is it the FBI's assessment of the attack at the Abbey Gate in Kabul, which killed 13 American servicemen and women, was carried out by somebody released from Bagram?
I don't have the intelligence to give or to share right now.
Okay, but you've seen the reporting.
I have seen the reporting.
Yeah. Going back to ISIS-K for a minute, question for both of you. So on Friday, there was an attack at a mosque in Kunduz in northern Afghanistan where dozens of Shia worshippers were killed at Friday prayers. ISIS-K claimed that attack. Ambassador Fitton-Brown, A, is the claim credible? B, are we going to see a lot more of this in a sense? Because one of the big changes since 9/11 is sectarianism. Well, obviously it always existed, but in Syria and Iraq and Yemen, we've seen versions of a sectarian civil war. So are you worried about that in Afghanistan? Do you think the ISIS-K claim is credible? Do you see more of this?
Yeah, I think the claim is credible. It's that sort of attack, sectarian attack, is very much a hallmark of ISIL, and they've done a lot of that in Afghanistan in the past. So I think it's credible, although I don't have any current reporting to attribute it conclusively to ISIL-K. I think, will we see more of it? Yes, I think we probably will. I think that question about where all this is going is interesting, and we must acknowledge that this is a dynamic picture. We don't really know exactly how the various power dynamics in Afghanistan are going to play out. It's worth remembering that the Taliban itself is not monolithic, and there is a certain amount of rivalry that is visible within the Taliban, with different factions thinking that they should have more of the spoils, with issues over the demotion of non-Pashtun Taliban. These are all issues that may affect the way that the Taliban control of the country evolves. And then I think there's this interesting question about, earlier we were talking about what might happen with al-Qaeda or indeed ISIL in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, I think, at the moment, they don't have the capacity to direct a threat from Afghanistan internationally. And so in a sense, it costs them nothing to do nothing at the moment other than to regroup, recruit, train, raise money and things of that kind. And I think they have a safe haven from which to do that, which means I think it becomes a very important platform for them. It was already important, but I think it becomes more important for them. I think from the Taliban's point of view, one of the difficult things for them is that if they take difficult decisions required of a governing authority to shut down extremist activity that they think is potentially going to cause them embarrassment or problems overseas. And bear in mind, they do need to worry about their relationships with not just the West, but with the whole international community and with their neighbors. So, they need to worry about whether there are threats incubating in Afghanistan that might be a problem for Central Asia or China or Pakistan or other countries. But of course, if they do take action to suppress that threat, or indeed to suppress other aspects of the insurgency that they conveniently allowed to go on, like the reliance on drug money to fund them, if they try to arrest people, stop people from organized crime, stop people from positions of respect as local hard men and all that sort of thing, that's the risk of ISIL attracting people away, both disillusioned Taliban and hardline foreign extremist elements. And ISIL has unmistakably positioned itself as the uncompromising rejectionist force in Afghanistan and has the potential to recruit quite a lot of people on that basis. And that's where I think you have that strategic rivalry between the two groups, and it's not clear how it will play out.
How long do you think al-Qaeda would take? Ambassador Fitton-Brown says they don't really have the capacity now to do anything sort of outside the region. How long would it take for them to regroup, let's say in a perfect world where everything went their way?
Well, I think right now it would probably be shorter if you're talking about regroup for an operational arm to do things. They have a lot of trained fighters that have a lot of experience. They're awash in technology and weapons right now in that country. Yeah. They have a lot of capabilities there, and I think right now they're riding high on a victory, so they do have people that are willing to fund them. They're going to probably bring in more funding right now than they normally would as well.
What's plausible, though? Attacking the United States is one thing. Attacking, say, an American target in the region. Correct. Attacking in Europe. How would you sort of grade those?
I think if you're talking, obviously, a near-field target, something's close, whether it be U.S. personnel, U.S. government installation, that's a victory for them. It's much easier to
in the region.
Yes, it's much easier to execute than it would be, going across the Atlantic and trying to hit the United States. But I definitely think that within a short period of time, years or maybe a year or less, maybe years, they could easily probably project that kind of an attack.
Ambassador Fitton-Brown, as I recall from your report, even before the Taliban took over the country, you said thousands of foreign fighters were going into Afghanistan from Central Asia and Pakistan. Is that correct? And have you seen anything additional since then?
So we said there were thousands in Afghanistan rather than a flow of in, because it's important to stress we haven't seen a wave of people coming to Afghanistan, but we assess that there could be anything up to 10,000 foreign extremists in Afghanistan. So it is a serious issue. And by the way, I do agree with the last answer. I think the last answer was a very well nuanced and balanced answer. And I think it's important to stress that there are different gradations of attack, and there are also different gradations of capability. There are people, CT experts, who argue that ISIL, for example, already has an external operational capability. And what they mean by that is that you don't need very much other than facilitators with smartphones in a secure location and with the right connections to help to amplify the kind of impact that a radicalized person might have in an inspired attack somewhere in Europe or potentially, I guess, in North America. But it is important to say that this falls a long way short of the kind of fully developed external operational branch that ISIL used to have, but had to give up after, when it was militarily defeated. And I think we have to recognize that regenerating the very basic capacity to assist or facilitate an attack, that could happen very quickly. It doesn't have to happen in Afghanistan. It can happen in any location where you have somebody with that kind of capability and desire. But to build something more substantial that's capable of bringing off a major high-impact international attack, that will take a bit longer. And that's also true of ISIL. ISIL also will take a bit longer to do that. What my worry is, and this is a message I do try to get across every time that I speak somewhere, is that at the moment, the threat level in non-conflict zones, and this particularly applies in North America, is artificially suppressed. It's artificially suppressed by very, very effective counterterrorism activity by the United States and a whole range of international counterterrorism actors. It's also been suppressed by COVID-19, by lockdowns, travel restrictions, and things of that kind. It's very important that the international community doesn't take long-running, far-reaching resource decisions on counterterrorism on the basis that this is the threat level that we should expect for the medium to long term. It is not. The threat level for the medium to long term is certainly going to rise.
I agree with that, and I think COVID was a great example of this. I also agree that I think that the Taliban success in Afghanistan, achieving their goals, will be a rallying cry to groups that they achieved what they wanted to do. I think you could see other groups, I mean, Hamas. I could see lots of other groups increasing their activity and increasing, I think, their targeted activity against especially against the West, based on the success of the Taliban. I think it's well said, Ambassador.
So to both of you, it certainly seems that the Taliban is likely to want to declare an Islamic emirate. And of course, you know, Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And so let's think about the summer of 2014 in Iraq. ISIS took over much of Syria and Iraq. You know what happened next: 40,000 foreign fighters, 6,000 of them were Westerners, a number of them Americans, mostly from Europe. Accepting that COVID, you know, makes travel harder, but you know, 2 years from now that may be less of an issue. Sketch out what the future could look like. I'll begin with you, Assistant Director. I mean, what do you think? What does 2 or 3 years down the road look like for Afghanistan? When I say Afghanistan, I mean also the tribal regions in Pakistan, the whole ecosystem there.
One thing I'd like you to just say are the tribal regions. I think one of the biggest problems we have in the West is we think of Afghanistan as a unified country, as a unified identity.
Yeah.
It is very much, as the ambassador said earlier about divisions with the Taliban, it is very tribal. So your tribal area has more sway over anything about your identity than anything in Afghanistan. I definitely think that it is much harder today for these travelers, COVID or regardless. I think we've learned our lesson. We've learned a lot of lessons about the foreign fighters moving in and out of Syria, moving in and out of Iraq. We're very successful in intercepting a lot of people trying to travel now because of those lessons learned, because of biometrics, because of the technology we have. I think we're much better at doing it. I also think it's actually physically harder to get in and out of Afghanistan. It is physically harder to get in and out of Afghanistan from the West than it is to get in and out of Syria, depending on where it is, just the location. I don't think it's going to be, it could be an issue, but my guess, and this is just my educated guess, I do not think European fighters coming into Afghanistan is going to be a huge issue for a little while. And I'm not sure the Taliban's going to want to allow that either, because I think that would bring additional scrutiny onto them if they find out that they are training Europeans as foreign fighters into the country. Ambassador?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think that's absolutely right. And again, that comes back to that point about the highly effective counterterrorism and international counterterrorism cooperation, and the fact that we must continue to invest in that. We must continue to build cooperation, and I think the UN has quite an important role in supporting that. I think what I'd like to sort of highlight for the next couple of years as a risk doesn't so much revolve around Afghanistan, because I think we've covered those risks quite well. I think that it's interesting to see the power of example here. I think what we have is definitely an increased inspiration for people who are just broadly insurgent in their mindset, alienated, angry, anti-Western. You've already got ISIL propaganda out there. You now have the power of this example of, what people are seeing as the Taliban's defeat of the West. So I think we have to look at the likelihood of increased incidences of inspired attacks in non-conflict zones. And I think the other aspect of this inspiration is going to be this successful takeover of a country is going to be looked at by people like al-Shabaab in Somalia and people like the Jainim coalition, the al-Qaeda aligned coalition in the Sahel, who are, already have created chaos in Mali and are increasingly encroaching in Burkina Faso and beyond Burkina Faso. And we need to think about whether we're going to see other fragile jurisdictions capsized, and whether you end up with a number of countries where it's possible for terrorist groups to have safe haven and then to regenerate the directed external operational capability that both al-Qaeda and ISIL currently lack.
Can I ask you, because one of the more, I think, novel aspects of all this is something that Ambassador Fitton-Brown mentioned in his report and that you also indicated, which is the spread of ISIS in Africa. And as far as I understand it, Africa doesn't have this sort of Shia component that was very much sort of almost ISIS's raison d'etre. Right. So what is the appeal of ISIS in Africa? And what is the long-term prognosis for them? And I'm confused a little bit about ISIS and Boko Haram and how they're what their relationship is now.
Well, I think, first of all, I think ISIS, in large part, I think the ambassador mentioned this as well, I think they've absorbed a lot of Boko Haram, a lot of what they're doing, a lot of their capabilities, a lot of their personnel, I think mainly because of their success. And it's one of those, I think, if you're in a bunch of groups that are kind of doing the same thing and you see one group is very successful, they seem to be taking the lead, they've got a better recruiting mantra, they seem to have more success, and they're waving their flag higher. I think that draws more people to their flag. And I think the key they have is their continued success. They have these successes and they're going to keep drawing more and more people to it and become more powerful. Their ability to destabilize these legitimate governments in these countries, I think, is real. And I think what's happened in Afghanistan, I think, has shown them that. And I think it may increase the frequency and potentially the intensity of their attacks in some of these areas.
And going back to something that Ambassador Fitton-Brown raised, which I think is very important. Let's say there was zero travel to Afghanistan, but this Islamic Emirate stroke al-Qaeda, the people in Afghanistan, are you concerned, let's say in the United States, about people doing, obviously San Bernardino, Orlando, these were carried out by people who had no direct contact with ISIS, never went to Syria or Iraq. Are you concerned about replications of that in the future in the United States?
Of course, I think that's the number one vulnerability. You don't have to travel, you don't have to do anything. They recruited online. Some of them aren't even recruited online. They're inspired online. They watch propaganda.
Are you seeing any evidence of that already?
Here in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
People inspired by this Taliban victory?
Yes.
What does that, are they just chatting on Facebook, or what does it look like?
Yes, that's what's going to be a lot of talk about it. And I think that's the first thing you see is where there's talk, there's more interest, there's more celebrate of it. I think that's where people who are on the fringes, potentially not mentally stable, not even affiliated with them, I think that's where they see as this rallying cry and their opportunity. Now it's time to buy a gun, run people over with a car, do whatever they're going to do, whatever, as al-Qaeda always says, you don't wait to plan something, just grab whatever you can and do it now, do an attack now. And I think this will definitely add some fuel to that fire.
Question for the ambassador. Zawahiri, is he alive, dead, not well? Is he an effective leader of al-Qaeda? Who might replace him? Saif al-Adil seems like a good replacement. Is there any evidence that Saif al-Adil has gone from Iran to Afghanistan? Now there's a sympathetic government.
So the answer to your last question is no evidence of that having happened yet. But yes, our understanding is that he remains the designated successor. We believe that Ayman al-Zawahiri is in poor health and struggles to be an effective leader of al-Qaeda. He's not a very good communicator at the best of times, and clearly these are not the best of times for him. So I think al-Qaeda is very aware of that succession issue. Before the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, we were saying in our last published report to the 1267 committee that it was a difficult decision for Saif al-Adil as to what he would do if he were called upon to become Zawahiri's successor. I don't think it's as difficult to call anymore. I think it's likely he would go to Afghanistan.
Sorry, you think Saif al-Adil will get to Afghanistan?
I think that's his most likely option. I don't think it's a certainty. We talked about the fact that he has an operational and personal history in Africa. It's not impossible that he could relocate to Africa, but I don't think there is any arena that is as promising for an al-Qaeda leader to be in at the moment as Afghanistan.
I'd have to agree with them, and I agree with the ambassador too about the communication issue. I think that's Zawahiri's. I think that's his big weakness, and it's always to me interesting that ISIS was so well at communicating, and they were a breakoff from al-Qaeda, and the only really extremist group that didn't learn to communicate well or learn from ISIS was al-Qaeda, and I do think that's an interesting dynamic that they never really did pick up on, and I think that has hurt them.
Switching gears a little bit, the counterterrorism coordinator John Godfrey mentioned a 320% increase in right-wing extremist attacks globally over the past 5 years. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, we now call them racially motivated violent extremists. So where the United States is the only one that calls them that, I think everyone else in the world calls it right-wing extremism. We're talking about the same thing. Yes, there's been a significant increase. And I think also there's an increase, and I also think there's more optic on tracking them. So I think one of it is we're actually seeing more, and I think the other is that we're actually looking at it more. So we might have more accurate tracking and classifying more potentially as incidents that might have not been classified before.
And John Godfrey mentioned also the Russian Imperial Movement, which, as you know, was the first white supremacist group to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, and that was by the Trump administration. So are you seeing more linkages that are meaningful between folks in the United States and people in Russia or other places that are part of this global, I'm going to call them right-wing extremists, that's what they are?
Yes. So, and I'll use the term right-wing extremists here just for this forum. Since it's a global forum, it's not a United States forum, so we'll use that. I think that is true. The last numbers I saw was, anywhere from about 17,000 plus or minus traveling to Europe, 17,000 in Ukraine, actually in the conflict zone, potentially right-wing extremists traveling there in that conflict zone. In Ukraine and Russia, the Imperial Movement, they've been basically a training camp. A lot of right-wing extremists have gone there, done weapons training. The reason the Imperial Movement was actually designated by the United States wasn't for attack in the U.S., it was an attack in Sweden by the Nordic Resistance Movement. 2 members there had actually trained in St. Petersburg with the Imperial Movement, then conducted an attack out in Sweden, an IED attack and an actual gun attack. And I think what these groups have learned there again, and if they're facilitated, inspired, or directed by foreign governments, is a question as well. We have to talk about what they've learned is we need to sell our brand and we need to go for a global brand. They learned this so well from ISIS. If you look at the base, which is an extremist group that operates out of the United States, a lot of their propaganda is right out of the ISIS book. They do a great job. They're very, very Western, very dynamic, very engaged at youth. They're very, cool videos they put out to try and attract these youth. And I think now they're communicating around the world with different groups, and they are moving exchange. And it is a worldwide movement. They're sharing information, they're sharing tactics. I think they're sharing funding. And I think all this is easier. There's encrypted applications now that you can buy an iPhone and from Apple that the FBI can't crack. You can get free encryption online that governments can't crack. You can move money now with cryptocurrency around the world that we can't trace. I think all these have enabled these groups to be globally connected. But I definitely think then there's also the aspect of it is we do have other countries like Russia that's actually on some level supporting or not enforcing laws on these groups that are operating out of those countries, whether they're supporting it or just not enforcing it by choice. I don't know, but they definitely have a hand in what's going on and are not assisting us in it.
Some of these domestic extremist groups in the United States were reported to have celebrated the Taliban victory. Did you see some of this?
I've seen that reporting. I personally have not read much about it, but I have seen some of the reporting on it.
So just a final question for both of you in the 3 minutes we have left. the Taliban takeover for Afghanistan, how would you score it? You know, there was the Soviet, the movement defeated the Soviets. Then there was 9/11. Is this as significant for the movement, the Taliban victory, or is this something different than, say, getting rid of the Soviets or the 9/11 attacks? I'll start with you, and then I'll end with the ambassador.
Boy, that's a tough question.
It wasn't intended to be.
That's a highly interpretive question. I would say yes. It's going to be celebrated. I mean, they said that they would wait the Americans out. They stuck to their plan. They're very patient people, and they're going to celebrate this for a long time. And they're going to celebrate it in line with those, and those will be their top three. I don't know what they'll rate as their most successful, but I think it will be up there, and I think they will build a lot off this victory.
Ambassador?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a quick answer to that, and then if I may, I'll make one additional unrelated point. The first thing is, I think, certainly comparable to the original takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 90s. Of course, it remains to be seen exactly how this will play out. But yes, I think this is a very strategically significant moment. And then the one thing I just wanted to add, because it just hasn't happened, it hasn't reared its head yet, but Syria, I want to mention. And the reason I want to mention it is because we mustn't always move with whatever the headlines are. Afghanistan is the headlines, and that, with good reason. It's really important. We're still talking a lot about Africa, and again, with good reason, it's really important, and there have been important developments there recently. Let's not forget that ISIL remains at its core an Iraqi and Syrian organization, and that the situation in Syria is politically unresolved, and that therefore the risk that a lot of the threats that we're talking about today will ultimately regenerate in Syria is one that we must not forget.
Very, very good point. We want to thank the ambassador and also the assistant director.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Thank you.